Hello, my name is Douglas Meyer, and I am conducting a presentation of my research proposal for Liberty University Counseling 515 Research and Program Evaluation. Um, I am hypothesizing that there is a difference in communication between couples raising an autistic child and couples raising a typically developing child. I first became interested in this topic over the last couple years as I've been doing research in my undergrad and now in the graduate program at Liberty University. Um, in which a lot of my topics dealt with family therapy with a subcategory of autism or developmental disabilities, as I myself am a father um, of a autistic child and also another child that is severely ADHD. And so throughout my undergraduate study and now my graduate study, I've continued to look at what uh, what I can do to make a difference in families that have these challenges and different situations and the difficulties that families face when raising a developmental child, such as an autistic child. And so I had started to look through the research and kind of look at what the research showed um, in reference to the divorce rates and some of the complications that came with raising an autistic child. And it was always under my initial impression that families or couples that had an autistic child had a divorce rate that was significantly higher than those couples raising a typically developing child. Um, it was interesting to find that the research on that specific question really differed in respect to the different type of empirical research that was out there. Early studies, in fact, showed that there was a significant difference in the relationship of married couples raising an autistic child versus that of a typically developing child. Although recent research has kind of swayed the other way and is now demonstrating that there is the possibility of less divorce for those couples raising a developmental child. Um, and I found it very fascinating going through the research that had shown such significant differences, which is what led me to the hypothesis that I just proposed, and that was that there is a level of communication that is different in um, couples communication when dealing with an autistic child versus that of a typically developing child or children. And so, just to kind of elaborate a little bit on what the research findings had suggested, um, in one proposal that was conducted, or one research that was conducted by Edna Heron in 1985, involving 67 mothers and 49 fathers of an autistic child. They sought to examine influential factors in which communication was one of those factors. Although the differences in communication had not been pinpointed, and the researchers pointed out that this was a likely area of further research, was to see if the communication may in fact be different among those couples raising an autistic child. And so I sought to propose a question to find out if there may be an answer to that, and to see if in fact communication is different with couples raising an autistic child versus those raising a typically developing child. And so in order to put together a research proposal, or to look at the research, naturally I had to come up with a method for examining the difference. And so, being a part of Autism Speaks and conducting autism, being on the board for Tennessee, I realized that I could easily tap into families within the network as well as within the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, which in Nashville deals with the high population of autistic children and has a school for autistic children. And so I began to examine what method I could use to look at an experiment and to really pinpoint the communication or communication differences between couples raising an autistic child and those raising a typically developing child. And so using the autistic child as a variance for the research project for the test, what I did is I then examined different tests to look at communication in married couples. The Enrich marital inventory seemed like a likely testing component because it examined 14 subcategories of different areas within marriage, most of which deal with communication. As a matter of fact, finances being one of those, and according to Fowers and Olson, finances typically with good finances in married couples, there typically is a higher form of communication, as the research has discovered. And so part of the Enrich marital inventory examines those type of questions within the marriage relationship. And according to the statistics, the Enrich survey is roughly 85 to 95% accurate when looking at the 14 subcategories and how those relate to couples and couple communication. Specifically, couple communication being one of the key 14 areas. And that's really the key area that I wanted to examine in my research for this proposal. And so what is proposed here is that we took 200 different couples, so 400 people, 200 couples, 100 of which were not raising an autistic child but had a typically developing child, and then 100 couples that had an autistic child, or at least an autistic child in the family. And we elicited the Enrich test and then went ahead and examined, proposed that we examine those scores, and then simply using a two-tailed t-test, individual t-test, we would examine the mean difference between the communication elicited from the 100 couples with an autistic child versus those raising a normally developing child. Thus, giving the higher means a greater form of communication, and looking at the difference. In this test, we are not proposing that one is higher than the other, but simply want to look at it, which is why we chose the two-tailed test, because we're not specifically hypothesizing one way or the other, given the information and the research that is currently out there. And so that is why I proposed this study, is because there doesn't seem to be a lot of empirical evidence to show the differences in communication. And the reason that I would like to find out whether there is a difference in that communication, as several research studies had shown that the level of communication had increased merely because of dealing with social support, the medical side of dealing with an autistic child, the educational side as the child gets older. Typically IEPs are involved, which research points towards a greater communication between those families. Thus, also, one of the points I'd like to point out is that there is a more purposeful part in raising a child that has a developmental disability such as autism, thus increasing the communication as well. And so I proposed that we would see exactly what the empirical data using the enriched test would show. Um, and one of the reasons is because by looking at the differences in communication, if in fact autistic or families or couples with an autistic child have a greater resiliency in marriage because of the communication aspect, then this is one area that therapists can learn to focus on and possibly teach other couples who are raising a typically developing child, or even couples that are just struggling with one another that don't even have children, but to be able to introduce a different style of communication that possibly could help strengthen marriages and just really help those couples out that struggle with this struggle in that area of their marriages. And so that is why I have proposed this research project. And again, my name is Douglas Meyer, and I thank you for listening.